He had no weapon. He never carried one. That was the whole point. The Red Cross brassard on his left arm was supposed to mean something. Out here, in the shattered remains of a French village, surrounded by the gray uniforms of 400 German soldiers, he wasn't sure it meant anything at all. His name was Desmond Doss, and he was about to do something no military manual had ever prepared anyone for. He was going to walk toward them. The year was 1944. The war in Europe had ground itself into a kind of mechanical brutality that no one who hadn't seen it could fully comprehend. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Entire generations had been swallowed whole. The Allied forces were pushing east from the beaches of Normandy, fighting for every hedgerow, every crossroads, every burned-out farmhouse that stood between them and Berlin. And somewhere in that colossal machinery of destruction, individual men were still making individual choices, choices that would echo long after the guns went silent. But to understand what Desmond Doss did on that autumn morning, to truly understand it, you have to go back to before the war, back to a small town in Virginia, where a boy grew up in a house with a print of the Ten Commandments on the wall, and believed, with every fiber of his being, that those words were not suggestions. Lynchburg, Virginia, 1919, a railroad town, a working town, the kind of place where men went to the foundry before dawn and came home smelling of iron and smoke. William Doss raised his sons the way most men of that era raised their sons, with hard work, with faith, and with a kind of stubborn dignity that the Depression couldn't quite crush. The family attended the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and for young Desmond, the faith wasn't performance. It was architecture. It was the frame around everything. He looked at that picture of the Ten Commandments every day, particularly the sixth one. Thou shalt not kill. Not thou shalt not murder. Not thou shalt not kill unless you have a good reason. Kill. Period. Most people would look at that commandment and see a moral aspiration. Desmond Doss looked at it and saw literal instruction. He wasn't being naive. He wasn't being cowardly. He had thought it through, with a careful, methodical mind that would later make him one of the most effective combat medics in American military history. He simply believed that a man could serve his country, could stand in the fire, could be the most useful soldier on the battlefield, without ever pulling a trigger. The Army was not immediately convinced. When Desmond Doss walked into a recruiting office in 1942, the country had been at war for less than a year. Pearl Harbor had shattered whatever remained of American isolationism, and men were lining up to enlist. Doss wanted to serve. He had been working in a shipyard, building carriers, doing his part, but that wasn't enough. He needed to be there, in it. He applied to be a combat medic. What followed was one of the most sustained campaigns of institutional cruelty ever visited upon a man who hadn't done a single thing wrong. His commanding officers wanted him gone. His fellow soldiers, the men he would eventually die for, tormented him openly. They threw boots at him while he prayed. They called him a coward. They called him a Section 8 waiting to happen. They filed paperwork to have him discharged as mentally unfit. Officers pressured him to accept a rifle. When he refused, they told him he would be court-martialed for disobeying a direct order. Doss stood there and took all of it. Not with resignation, not with defeat. He stood there the way a mountain stands there, not arguing with the wind, simply remaining. He wrote letters to his young wife Dorothy, who had given him a Bible before he shipped out. He memorized passages. He went to chapel on Saturdays, because Saturday was the Sabbath, and that was non-negotiable. His fellow soldiers hated that too. What none of them understood, not yet, was that the very qualities that made Desmond Doss difficult to be around in a barracks were the qualities that would make him impossible to stop on a battlefield. The stubbornness, the absolute, unshakable belief that he was doing the right thing, the complete absence of self-doubt, even when everyone around him was certain he was wrong. It would take a place called Hacksaw Ridge to prove it. But before Hacksaw Ridge, before Okinawa, there was a French village, and 400 Germans, and a bluff that nobody, not his commanders, not his enemies, not even the men whose lives depended on it, expected him to call. By the late summer of 1944, the 77th Infantry Division, Doss's division, the Statue of Liberty Division, had been fighting its way through the Pacific and was preparing for eventual reassignment to more intense combat theaters. But elements of the broader American push through France and into Germany were revealing the texture of what this war had become. Other army units had been grinding through France since D-Day in June, and the pattern had established itself with grim repetitiveness. Take a village, hold it, move to the next one, repeat until either you won or you didn't come back. The village of Bruyères in the Vosges Mountains of eastern France would become one of the defining engagements of that autumn. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the Japanese-American unit whose story deserves its own documentary, its own monument, its own place in the permanent consciousness of this nation, was fighting there alongside other Allied forces. The Vosges were brutal terrain, dense forest, steep ridges, October mud that sucked at boots and turned supply lines into nightmares. The Germans had fortified the region carefully, understanding that the mountains formed a natural defensive barrier before the Rhine, before Germany itself. It was in this broader context, units pinned down, supply lines stretched, communication fragmented, that Desmond Doss found himself in a situation that had no entry in any field manual. The specifics of that morning require a moment of reconstruction, because what happened exists at the intersection of documented military record and the testimony of men who were there and spent the rest of their lives trying to find words adequate to what they witnessed. The patrol had gone wrong in the way patrols go wrong in dense terrain, not with a single catastrophic error, but with a series of small ones, each reasonable in isolation, collectively disastrous. Radio contact had been intermittent. The lead element had pushed further than intended. And then, in the gray early light filtering through the firs, they had walked directly into the perimeter of a German position, far larger than anyone had estimated. The Americans were surrounded before they fully understood they were surrounded. German soldiers materialized from the treeline, from behind stone walls, from the rubble of the village buildings. They came from every direction, and they came in numbers that made the arithmetic of resistance immediately and obviously hopeless. The Americans who were there later described the sensation as a kind of unreality, the way the mind refuses, for a few seconds, to process information that has no good interpretation. 400, give or take, against a handful of Americans who were now, in every tactical sense of the word, finished. The German officer in command, his name has been variously reported in different accounts, and the historical record here demands some humility, appeared at the head of his men with the composed authority of someone who had done this before. The message was clear even before it was translated. Surrender. Now, you have no options left. The American soldiers looked at each other, and then they looked at the man standing among them who had never fired a weapon in his life. Desmond Doss. He was not looking at his fellow soldiers. He was looking at the German officer. Something was happening behind his eyes, something that the other men couldn't quite read. It wasn't fear. They all knew what fear looked like on a man's face by now. They had seen it in mirrors. This wasn't fear. It was calculation. Here is what Desmond Doss understood in those seconds that the men around him did not. He understood something about the mathematics of surrender. He had spent enough time in the field, had moved among enough wounded men, had watched enough life drain out of enough bodies, to know how these moments worked. Surrender was not safety. In the chaos of a forward position, in the heat of a moment, with 400 armed men, and the particular electricity that combat creates in human nervous systems, surrender could become massacre without anyone formally deciding to commit one. He had seen what happened to men who were helpless. He had been the man kneeling in the mud, applying pressure to a wound, whispering to someone that they were going to be all right, long past the point where he was certain they weren't. He knew what helplessness looked like from the outside, and he knew it invited a particular kind of calculation in the men holding the guns. He also understood something about the Red Cross on his arm. Under the Geneva Conventions, the international agreements that were, in theory, governing the conduct of this war, a medical soldier bearing the Red Cross emblem was a protected person. He could not be targeted. He could not be taken prisoner in the same way a combatant could. He existed in a different legal and moral category. The conventions were not always honored. Anyone who had served in this war knew that with sickening certainty. But they were not nothing. They carried weight. They created, at minimum, a moment of hesitation. Doss was betting everything on that moment of hesitation. What he did next, and this is documented, this is attested to by multiple witnesses, was stepped forward, not toward the other Americans, toward the Germans. He walked through the perimeter of his own men, past the rifles, past the hands that reached out instinctively to stop him, past the whispered and urgent and profane objections of soldiers who thought they were watching a man walk to his death. He walked toward 400 German troops, and he held up his arm, the Red Cross brassard, the white field, the Red Cross, and he spoke. His German was essentially non-existent. His tone was not. Tone crosses language barriers in the way that almost nothing else does. Desmond Doss's voice, in that moment, carried not defiance and not supplication, but something stranger and more difficult to dismiss. It carried absolute conviction, the voice of a man who was not performing courage because he was too busy actually having it. What happened in the next 30 seconds would determine whether every man in that clearing lived or died. The German officer did not shoot him. This sounds simple. It was not simple at all. Think about what that officer was processing. He had a legitimate military advantage. He had numbers. He had position. He had, by every conventional measure, already won this engagement. The rational response to a single unarmed man walking toward you out of a group of surrounded enemy soldiers is not complicated. You take him. You take them all. You process them as prisoners of war. You move on. But Doss wasn't moving like a prisoner of war. He was moving like a man arriving at a negotiation. There is a psychological principle that military historians have identified in moments like this. Call it the authority of certainty. When a person moves with complete conviction, when their body language broadcasts zero ambivalence, something happens in the people watching them. The mind, even a trained soldier's mind, reaches for a framework to explain what it's seeing. And the most available framework, when someone walks toward you with absolute confidence and a red cross on their arm, is, this person knows something I don't. What did Doss say exactly in those moments? The accounts vary in their details, as eyewitness accounts of high-stress situations always do. The core of it is consistent. He identified himself as a medical soldier. He invoked the Geneva Conventions. He stated clearly that he was there to care for the wounded on both sides. And he did not, at any point, flinch. He did not look back at his fellow Americans. He did not look down at the ground. He held the German officer's gaze with the calm of a man who has already made his peace with every possible outcome and found all of them acceptable. The German officer was quiet for a long moment. The 400 men behind him were quiet too. The forest made its small sounds. Wind, a branch, somewhere in the distance, the sound of artillery that had been background noise. For so long it barely registered anymore. And then the German officer made a decision. He didn't know, and couldn't have known, who he was looking at. He didn't know that this slight, unassuming Virginia boy had already performed acts of valor that would, in a few months, earn him the Medal of Honor, the only conscientious objector in American history to receive one. He didn't know about the night on Hacksaw Ridge that was still coming, when Doss would spend 12 hours alone on a cliff under fire, lowering 75 wounded men to safety, repeating to himself over and over, "Lord, let me get one more, just one more." He didn't know any of that, but he could see what was in front of him. A man who was not afraid. A man who was not pretending to be unafraid, which is a thing soldiers can always detect because they have to be very good at detecting it. A man who had genuinely, somewhere in the architecture of his soul, resolved the question of his own mortality in a way that left no room for the leverage that fear provides. The German officer released the Americans. He released them. The accounts differ on exactly what was said, exactly what terms were acknowledged, whether there was any formal exchange or simply a gesture, a wave, a nod, the particular body language of a man choosing to look the other way. What the witnesses agree on is that the German soldiers stepped back, and the Americans walked out of that clearing, and Desmond Doss walked among them, and nobody fired a shot. One medic, no weapon, 400 Germans, and he called the bluff that wasn't really a bluff at all, because the thing he was betting on was real, had always been real, even when the whole world seemed to be organized around proving it wasn't. He was betting on the idea that there is something in a human being that responds to courage and conviction, that even in the machinery of war there are men who retain the capacity to recognize something worth recognizing. He was right. He was not always right. That is the thing that has to be said. This is not a fairy tale. The war was not a fairy tale. Desmond Doss would go on to witness things that no fairy tale could contain. On the island of Okinawa, in the spring of 1945, at a place the Americans called Hacksaw Ridge, the escarpment at Maeda, a 400-foot cliff of jagged volcanic rock that had been turned by the Japanese into one of the most fortified defensive positions in the Pacific, the 77th Infantry Division would face something beyond the capacity of most human beings to even imagine, let alone survive. The Battle of Okinawa was the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific Theater. 82 days of fighting that killed over 12,000 Americans and somewhere between 70 and 100,000 Japanese soldiers, plus tens of thousands of Okinawan civilians caught in the middle of a catastrophe not of their making. It was, in the assessment of military planners, a preview of what a land invasion of the Japanese home islands would look like. The numbers they projected for such an invasion, the casualties on both sides, were so staggering that they fundamentally shaped the decision to deploy the atomic bomb. But the math of that decision belongs to another story. At Hacksaw Ridge, on the night of May 4th, 1945, the only math that mattered was this. American forces had been driven back from the escarpment under overwhelming fire. They had retreated down the cliff face, and they had left their wounded at the top. Dozens of men, wounded, unable to move, lying on a plateau controlled by Japanese forces in a network of underground tunnels that had been built specifically to make the position unassailable. A position so well defended that American commanders had already classified the men on top as, effectively, beyond rescue. They had not consulted Desmond Doss. He had been helping other wounded men when the retreat began. By the time he understood what was happening, that the order had come down, that they were pulling back, that the men on top were being left, he had already made his decision. He didn't go down the cliff. He went back toward the wounded, alone, in the dark, on a plateau lit by Japanese flares and swept by Japanese fire, moving through the noise and smoke and the small terrible sounds of wounded men. Desmond Doss did what he had always done. He went to the next one. He stabilized him. He dragged him to the edge of the cliff. He had learned a knot, a special lowering knot, that he rigged from a field-expedient rope, and one by one, under fire, through the night, he lowered men to safety. He talked to himself while he did it. The witnesses who heard him, both that night and in the years after when they finally had language for what they'd seen, described the same thing. A quiet, continuous repetition, almost a prayer, almost a conversation, always the same words. Lord, let me get one more. Just one more. He got 75. The official army count, which is actually a conservative figure, because the chaos of that night made exact accounting impossible, is 75 men. Some of the surviving soldiers put the number higher. One analysis places it at closer to 100. What everyone agrees on is this. There were no other Americans on that cliff. There was no covering fire. There was no unit. There was one man, without a weapon, in the dark, and he worked until there was no one left to carry. In the weeks that followed, Doss himself was wounded 3 times. A grenade explosion drove metal fragments into his legs. He waited 5 hours for medics, because he kept treating other casualties while he waited, kept waving the stretcher-bearers past him toward men he judged worse off. And when they finally came for him, he spotted a soldier lying in the open and rolled off his own stretcher to crawl to the man's side. He was shot by a sniper on the way back. The bullet hit his arm, and he wrapped it himself with a rifle stock as a splint and crawled 300 yards to the aid station. By the time the war ended, Desmond Doss had been awarded the Medal of Honor, 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Bronze Stars for valor, and a commendation from the President of the United States. President Harry Truman shook his hand and told him he was prouder to meet Doss than to be president. But none of that captures what actually happened. What actually happened was this. A man with no weapon became one of the most effective soldiers in American military history because he had figured out something the military itself hadn't. That the definition of courage is not the willingness to kill. The definition of courage is the willingness to be present in the worst possible place, doing the most necessary possible thing, with no protection and no guarantee. That definition is available to everyone. It requires no weapon to fulfill it. The men who had tormented him in the barracks, who had thrown boots at him, called him a coward, tried to have him dishonorably discharged. did something after the war that tells you everything you need to know. They talked about him. Constantly. Everywhere. In bars and at reunions, and in the aching middle of the night hours, when men who had seen combat find themselves awake and unable to stop remembering. They talked about him with a reverence so intense it borders on the religious, because for many of them it was religious, or at least, it was the closest thing to a genuine miracle they had ever witnessed with their own eyes. Sergeant Howell, who had once tried to transfer Doss out of the unit because he believed a pacifist had no place in combat, spent the rest of his life telling anyone who would listen what he had seen on that cliff. Captain Jack Glover, who had pressed Doss hard on the rifle issue and genuinely believed the man was a liability, became one of his most vocal advocates. Men who had never prayed in their lives prayed for Desmond Doss's safety in the field, not as a performance, not as a metaphor. They prayed the way you pray when you've seen something you can't explain, and you need the universe to protect it. What had changed? Nothing about Doss. He was exactly the man he had always been. What changed was their understanding. War had given them the context to comprehend what they'd been looking at. They had been looking at the rarest possible thing, a man in complete harmony with his own convictions, without any of the cracks that fear and self-interest introduce into most human character. A man who was, in the full and literal sense of the word, whole. After the war, Doss came home to Dorothy. He was not well. The wounds had done their work. Tuberculosis, contracted in the Pacific, would cost him a lung. The shrapnel in his legs would trouble him for years. He was partially deaf from the artillery that had been his constant companion for years of combat. He farmed a little. He raised his son. He went to church on Saturdays. He did not talk about the war very much, except when asked. And then he talked about it with the particular precision of a man who is determined to remember it accurately. Not heroically, accurately. He was careful to note the men who fought alongside him, the medics who had trained him, the officers who had eventually come to support him. He was less interested in his own story than in the aggregate story, the story of what all of them had done together. When a filmmaker named Mel Gibson made a movie about his life, Hacksaw Ridge, released in 2016, 70 years after the events it depicted, Doss did not live to see it. He died in 2006 in a Veterans Administration hospital in Alabama at the age of 87. The film was acclaimed for the ferocity of its combat sequences. Reviewers noted, somewhat in awe, that Gibson, whose entire career had been built on action and violence, had created the most gripping war film in years and centered it on a man who never fired a shot. That is perhaps the truest and most durable irony of Desmond Doss's story. The most violent medium found its most powerful story in the most nonviolent man. Go back to that clearing for a moment. The German officer, the 400 soldiers, the unarmed man in the Red Cross brassard walking forward through the morning light. What made it work? It wasn't a trick. Doss wasn't running a confidence scheme. He wasn't deploying psychology in any calculated or manipulative sense. He was simply doing what he always did, showing up, without any of the usual protective coverings that human beings wrap themselves in when they're afraid, and being exactly what he was. A medic, a man whose only function was to prevent death. There is a theory, and it's not exclusively a military theory. It appears in philosophy and theology and behavioral science with considerable consistency, that genuine moral authority is recognizable, that when someone has actually resolved the question of what they're willing to die for, something in their bearing changes, and other people respond to it without necessarily understanding why. Warriors throughout history, in cultures around the world, have documented this recognition. The person who is not afraid of you in the way that fear of death creates. The person who has found something larger than self-preservation to organize their actions around. The German officer looked at Doss and saw that person. Whether he consciously processed it that way, whether he told himself a story about the Geneva Conventions or military honor or simple human decency, we can't know. What we know is what he did, and what he did was step aside. Desmond Doss won the Medal of Honor, wearing a uniform, serving his country, following orders mostly. He never fired a weapon. He never wanted to. He believed, and continued to believe until the day he died, that his Bible and his faith were the most powerful things he carried into combat. It would be easy to reduce this to a simple message. Pacifism works. Kindness wins. Something tidy and usable. But that would be dishonest. Plenty of conscientious objectors were killed. Plenty of medics were shot through their Red Cross brassards by enemies who had made a different calculation. The protections of the Geneva Conventions were routinely ignored on every front of this war. Doss's survival was partly his extraordinary personal courage, partly his extraordinary skill, and partly the fact that on certain days, in certain moments, he encountered men on the other side who still had some piece of their humanity accessible to them. War is very good at destroying that piece. It is perhaps the primary thing war is designed to destroy. The remarkable thing, the thing that should make us sit very quietly for a moment and think, is not that Doss's approach worked every time. It's that it worked at all. That in the middle of the most destructive event in human history, in the clearing in a French forest with 400 armed men and one unarmed one, the unarmed one won. Not because the world is just, not because goodness is always rewarded, but because on that particular morning, the German officer looked at Desmond Doss and saw, maybe for the first time in years of war, a man who reminded him of something he thought the war had taken from him, something he didn't quite have language for, standing there in the cold October light, with his rifle and his orders, and 400 men at his back. He saw a man who still believed. And for a moment, long enough for a handful of Americans to walk out of that clearing alive, he chose to believe too. Desmond Thomas Doss, Private First Class, 307th Infantry Regiment, 77th Infantry Division, born February 7, 1919, Lynchburg, Virginia, died March 23, 2006, Piedmont, Alabama, Medal of Honor recipient, the only conscientious objector so honored in the history of the United States military. He never fired a single shot. He saved approximately 100 lives. He walked toward 400 armed men with nothing but a red cross on his arm and a conviction in his chest that the world does not understand and cannot quite explain and cannot quite forget. The Germans stepped aside, and somewhere in the accounting of that war, in the vast and terrible ledger of what human beings are capable of doing to each other, there's this small and stubbornly luminous entry. One man, no weapon, 400 enemies, and he walked out, and so did they.